The components of the pieced front panel, if you're doing all three sections, which includes the top, the bottom, and then the decorative overlay strip, you will have these three pieces here. And this is what it will look like when we're finished. This is what it will look like from the back. So to begin with, you'll have your top panel, which the measurements and everything are in the pattern. So you'll have your top panel, and then you'll have your bottom panel. Then you're going to have a decorative strip. Now with your decorative strip, to help make things a little easier to make sure it's nice and straight, there's a couple of options. Because what we want to do is we want to have this panel here, this little decorative strip, folded in half like that, and then it's going to be laid over. Now I'm going to show you a couple of ways that you can do this, so to help get everything lined up once this is joined together. So to prepare this strap, you can either fold the strip in half and press it. That will create a crease down the center of this decorative strip. Then you can just fold this one of the sides to the center, and that will meet up in the halfway mark. Then you can fold this section over, and that will meet up in the halfway mark. Then you can just press that and you'll have like a completed folded decorative strip. The other way you can prepare this is to mark a line at that halfway in the center. This strip, by the way, is 2 inches wide, so you'd be marking a line at that 1 inch mark and then a line at the 1/2 inch mark. What you can then do is fold up one of the sides there, the side that you didn't do the 1/2 inch mark, fold it up to meet that line in the middle and give it a press. Then with this side here, we can use this line here as a stitching guide. So when we lay this down, we've got a nice straight little line. These will be joined together. You can line that fabric up along this seam line that we're going to create, and then you can just fold that down, and you won't have a lip at the top of this panel here. This panel here, what I did is I did the version where I do have a lip. So to do the lip, what I did with that one is I folded it in half so everything matched in the middle, so that my strip is the same distance of width right across. Then what I did is I placed a piece, once I joined this panel, I just used a wash away tape. In this instance I used the quilter's wash away tape. I placed that tape down the center of this line. Then, having this piece folded, I could then easily, I'd see my seam allowance and the fold that I've created in the middle, I could just line it up down the center of that and lay it across. Of course this would be folded under, and make sure it's nice and straight. I could use a ruler to make sure it's nice and straight. If it's off center a little bit, doesn't really matter. The main thing is you want to try and get it to match up whatever way you apply it, so that when this is put together, this little panel here, these match. So if you were to place this sort of here, you'd want this one placed the same. But so for this little section, what we're going to do first off is we're going to sew these together. In the instructions I've said to sew your seam allowances with a 1/2 inch. The reason being, it makes it easier to press the side seams open, gives the seams a little more structure as well, and it's quite a common seam allowance in bag making. If you wanted to use your presser foot as a consistent seam allowance throughout your whole bag, you can do that by doing this seam here at 3/8 of an inch instead of a 1/2 inch. It will just make your bag slightly bigger. Like, the difference will be barely minimal. The main thing is that you're consistent with the seam allowance throughout this whole bag. So if you use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, you'll use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you'll just do that throughout the whole bag. If you do a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, again there, do that through the whole making of the bag. If you've got a directional print, you will want your print facing up, and if this is your bottom panel, these are your little cutouts here. So that's our little cutouts. We're going to be flipping the bottom panel up, so it's laying on top of the top panel, and we're going to line up these raw edges along here. Now you can either pin or clip to keep these edges together, or you can just sort of use line it up as you're going. Now, a quick little tip: if you're going to be using clips, don't place a clip or a pin right at the end here, because this is going to be where you're going to be putting this under your presser foot, and your pin or your clip will be in the road. So my suggestion is, if you want to make sure this is nice and straight, place a little clip up there, and then get another clip. I'll use one of my black ones so you can see it better. Place another clip about down here. That way then you've got plenty of room to place this top edge underneath your presser foot. So what I usually do, I don't start pinning or clipping up here. I'll place one there, then I'll come down to this bottom edge. I'll line up these edges. So this is all lined up along the bottom. So line those up. Get this edge and this edge lined up so it's all nice and square. Then I can place a clip down the bottom here. Here doesn't matter, I can place it right at the end. And then I will come in, just make sure this is all laying nice and flat. That way you know then that these panels are neatly centered. So if there is a slight little variation of 1/8 of an inch or a couple of millimeters in the width, you can evenly distribute it across this whole seam. Then I'll place a clip or a pin in the middle, keeping those edges lined up. If I'm using a pin, I'll show you when I'm using a pin, I'll have these edges lined up, place my pin in this way, and then just press that down so it's nice and flat, keeping those edges. Pins can distort seams sometimes, but pins are actually more secure than a clip. With a clip, you do have the chance that this fabric sometimes can shift, because your clip, like, it can move, whereas a pin, it won't move. And if you lay your pins going flat this direction against the way you're sewing, there's no risk that this is going to slip up or down. Everything will stay exactly where you placed it. So I can line those up and I can place another pin. Place as many pins or clips that you feel comfortable with to help keep your work nice and straight. Again there, if you don't feel that you need pins or clips, just go ahead and just keep those edges all nicely lined up. Now I'm sewing with a pink thread here, so I've already got my interfacing, everything's already done. I've used a pink thread because I want you to be able to see my stitches. And I just thought it's fun because I'm using such a fun print, so I'm going to use pink thread throughout this whole bag. Now I'm using, for my construction seams, I'm using a stitch length of 2.4. The main thing is, if you are going to be using the edge of your presser foot or whatever seam allowance you are going to use, whether it's the 1/2 inch seam allowance or the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, be consistent throughout constructing, especially these pieced panels. Really important. Otherwise you're going to have one side will be taller, one side will be longer. So I've got my edges all nicely lined up, placing my fabric in. I'm coming down a little ways on that seam line, got my foot down, then I'm going to reverse stitch. Saves building up bulk. This way I've only got 2 layers of thread in that seam allowance instead of 3 layers of thread. If I start right on the edge, I've got the risk that my thread can get caught up in the foot, plus then I'm building up layers. Whereas if I come down and start and go back, I've just got 1 layer of threads, then I'll come forward, that's 2 layers of thread. That's more than enough to lock in that seam allowance there. So I can put my foot down and I can reverse stitch. Again there, I can use the edge of my foot as a guide. Now I can go forward, and those stitches are nice and secure. So either follow whatever seam allowance you've decided to use. Again there, I'm using a 3/8 of an inch for this sample because that was what I used on my other piece. If you've got pins, it's up to you if you want to take them out as you're going. I recommend when you're first starting out sewing, take your pins out as you go. Hold your fabric just to keep it nice and flat, but don't sort of pull on it or push on it, just sort of help guide it through. Take that pin out. When I get to the end here, I can already see everything seems to be lining up nicely at the edge there. Because I put those pins in, I have no risk of that fabric moving. And I'll take that clip out. When I get to the end, I will reverse stitch to lock those stitches. Really important to lock those stitches because we will be pressing those seams open at the sides, so you do want those locked and secured. So that's all stitched in place. So what we want to do now is trim your threads so you don't have the chance of threads getting caught in your seam allowances and then visible on the right side of your bag when you turn it out. What we want to do now is we're going to, this was what it will look like when it's finished, but what we want to do now is I'm going to go to the pressing station. I'll give this just a quick little press, then I'm going to press those seams open and flat. So I want this to be open and flat, that way then I don't have the bulk of all the fabric on one side or the other. If I was to press it down here, I would have more bulk. When I press these open, it distributes the bulk there evenly over a longer distance. So I'm just going to go and press these open like that. Okay, so I'm back now and I've pressed my seam open so you can see everything's sitting lovely and flat, and this is what it looks like from the wrong side. So all nice and flat, evenly distributed. So what we want to do now is we want to add in our decorative strip. So here's the decorative strip that I showed before. For this instance, I had placed a mark in the center along the long edge, then I've pressed that edge of the fabric up to meet that line there. What I'm going to do now, because I've got a stitch line guide that I already marked, and that's my raw edge, all I need to do to help make this nice and straight, I can line up this raw edge along that stitch, like this seam line. That will help me get a nice straight even edge with no lip when we turn this over, and no risk that this is going to be on there like really crooked. So I've got my little stitch line, my raw edge here is lined up on that seam line there, and I can just line up that edge, keeping, all I have to do, which I can adjust this as I'm going, there's no need to pin it because you can just stitch little bit by little bit as you go. So I'm going to come in a little, I'm going to do some back stitching, put my needle down, do a few back stitches, and then I'll come forward. The machine's doing the rest. Again there, line that little edge up to there and sew. I can adjust this fabric, line it up and sew. Again there, adjust this fabric and sew. Line it up on that edge, that nice and flat, and sew. Go, like if you just want to do little bit by little bit, inch by inch, to make sure everything stays nice and straight, line that little edge up there, and my needle is following that stitch line. Now if your fabric stretches a little bit, or if you've cut it wrong, we can just trim this off at the end. Lay that down. And we're still lined up right on this edge here. And I'll lock those stitches in place. Here we go. So that's all stitched down. What I like to do is see if there's any of these little frayed edges of the fabric, I'll just remove those away, just so I don't have any chance that they'll be seen in the fabric when it's folded over. Now all I need to do, because this is already nice and straight, I can just go and I can finger press if I just want to finger press. Can do that. Or I can go as well, give this a little press with your fingers and then head over to the sewing machine, give that another little press so that it sits down and lays nice and flat for you. And then we just need to come back then and we'll top stitch here. I'm going to go and press mine. I sort of really like when I'm working with fabric, a bit like, because I make a lot of clothes, a bit like dressmaking, I like to press my seams as I go. I just find the end result is a much neater finish. So I'll be back in a minute. I'll go and press this. Okay, I'm back again. So you can already see after pressing that this is lovely and nice and flat and smooth, so which is going to make it really easy for stitching this down. Now what we're going to do again there, start on that edge, and we're going to be doing like a top stitch along this edge. Then we'll be doing a top stitch along the opposite edge there from that stitch, that seam that we sewed there to attach it. Now you can use like a edge guide foot or something like that if you find it hard to sew a straight line. I tend to just eyeball it. I will find a marking somewhere on my foot, or I'll keep an eye somewhere in here, and I will just use that as my guide for sewing this seam. I am going to increase my top stitching length for this one to help make it a little bit more visible for you to see. I'm going to use a stitch length of 3.5. Generally, a lot of times I'll use between a 3 and a 3.5 for my top stitching. Depends on what I'm making. Now, if you find it hard to sort of keep this down, because we don't want to place pins or anything in here because it will distort the fabric, you can use like a sewing awl, or I've got like this little tool here. If you like this little tool, I can't remember the name of it off by hand, but I can leave a link for you if you're interested in this one. I just find it really handy. I've got a little bit of glue on that tip there. But it's got a flat edge and it's also got a pointed edge. So I can sort of use this, it's like 2 fingers, and I can really hold this down nice and flat to keep this sort of from warping and stretching out. So that's what I'm going to be doing for this one. So I'm going to come in just a little, because I just want this top stitching, a little bit of back stitching just inside my seam allowance. Just 1 or 2 stitches is all I need, and I can keep coming forward. So to use this tool, I can just hold this down flat, keeps everything in place as I go. Now for this top stitching, I do tend to go a little slower when I'm top stitching. I just want to try and keep that fairly straight because I'm sort of eyeballing it to say. Can see there, this has helped keeping this nice and flat, and I can get that flat little bit of that right under and right up close to the needle of my machine. Again, then make sure you don't stitch over it though, but it does work really well keeping everything nice and flat and in place. Sorry about that little interruption, my husband came home. So I'll just keep this going. If you find that your fabric starts to bunch up at all because it's getting pushed through, you can lift your presser foot and just release some of that fabric there. Mine's going okay because I've been holding it as I've been going. I like to take my time when I'm doing my top stitching because it is one of those decorative elements that can be quite visible, especially if you're using a contrast fabric. And we've come to the end, and I will just do 1 or 2 little locking stitches, and they'll be inside that seam allowance, and cut my threads. So that's all held down nice and secure and in place. No puckering or bubbles or anything because I was guiding it as I was going. So I'm going to come back the other way now, and I'm going to do my top stitching along this edge here. Because this is already stitched down along here, I really don't need my little tool because everything's going to stay in place where it should be. Lining this up, so keeping a consistent distance for top stitching throughout there. I can go a little faster on this side because I'm not holding anything down. But still though, I don't want to go too fast because I don't want to fall off the edge of my fabric or get too crooked and have a wonky top stitching. I'm just guiding my fabric through, And I'll just do just 1 or 2 little locking stitches there to secure that in place. And now I've got my 2 rows of decorative top stitching there. So that finishes our pieced panel. What we'll just do is any little fabrics that might be hanging over, we can just trim those off. And this is what we've got from the back. We've got our seam stitching line, and then we've got our top stitching line there as well. So that's not going anywhere. Let's trim these off. I might even just trim this off now, just to get these little edges nice and even. I like to trim this from the back side so I can see the fabric as well. And that's done. They're even. They're ready to go. Okay, so in this section we're going to be working on one of our main panels here. I've got one here that's not pieced, and I have got my zipper pocket facing, which I have drawn the window in. So for this zipper pocket facing, the measurements are actually in the pattern, but what I've done is this is 2 inches, and then a window here that is 3/8 of an inch, and then this here is 1 inch, and I've marked the centers, and I've drawn a line in 1 inch in from each of the short side edges. I've also, on my lining panel, I have marked a line 2.5 inches down from the raw edge of the top of the panel, and I've also marked the center. So all I need to do is line up this cut edge of the facing to that line that I drew, and line up those center markings. If you're going to place a couple of pins to hold this in place, I recommend placing your pins away from where you're going to be stitching. So, and trying not to distort this, because we want to keep this nice and straight up along here. So you could just place 1 pin there, come along to this other edge, place a pin up here. I can remove these pins as I'm sewing. I just don't want to have to. I don't want them to get in my road as I'm sewing. That's the old idea of the main thing. So you can see I'm right away from where my presser foot on my sewing machine is going to be, and that's keeping that all nice and secure in place. So zipper pocket facing down, so they're right sides together. And all we're going to do is we're going to sew a box following those lines on the facing that we drew. So that's ready to go. Now I've also got my zipper pocket panels. So these are, when we open up the zipper, this is what we will see when we look inside. And I've also got my zipper here, and that's ready to go as well. I cut my zipper a little bit longer so that when I'm sewing the zipper to these pieces, I can pull that zipper pull out of the way, so I get a nice straight stitching line. But I'll show you that when we get to that section there. So this is what we need to work on our zipper pocket. Okay, so we're back at the sewing machine, and we're going to be sewing our zipper pocket window facing. I've got my stitch length set to a length of 2. I like to have my stitch length smaller. This way I find, especially when I'm sewing with fabrics, cotton fabrics, it makes it easier to get a nice crisp fold line when I go to turn this right side out, which you'll see shortly. And then also when I get to my corners, I will generally reduce that stitch length down, even sometimes a little bit more, to help me get nice sharp crisp corners here. So I'll let you know when we get there. So lining up my needle so that it's going to stitch as close as I can, as accurately as I can along that line that we drew. There's no need to back stitch because we will go around and we'll overlap those stitches there a little bit. All I need to do is focus on sewing a fairly straight line. Coming up close to that corner, I'm just going to reduce that stitch length down to a 1.5. I'm just doing 1 stitch at a time. I've just hit that corner, turn around. Also helps me hit the lines where I want to hit them as well. So again there, I'm just following that little line, and I'll stop at that corner until I get around the corner. Now I'm going to change back to a stitch length of 2. You don't have to do that. I just find that it helps me get a nice straight line. Keep both hands on your fabric because we're going through like our machine bed here. So if you've only got a small machine bed, you might want to just roll that fabric up there so it doesn't get caught on here. And I just stitched over about four or five stitches there, and now I can cut those threads. Okay, I can trim this thread tail off. I can now take those pins out, and as you can see, they didn't get in my road while I was sewing, but everything was held in place nice and securely, so nothing shifted. Just check the back. My little thread ties are here. They're all right. I can trim those a little bit if I like. I think my little sharp scissors aren't no longer sharp anymore. I had these tied to my machine because they were nice and sharp. So now what we need to do is we're going to cut a window through here. We're going to cut a line through the center there, and then here we've got like these little flag bits here. So from round about this point, I just roughly drew it, so about a half inch or so in. We're going to stop cutting here, and we're going to come up to those corners, cut into that corner, but don't cut those stitches. And then just come over to this side, cut into that corner, but again, don't cut those stitches. And then we're going to do the same coming over and trimming into these corners. Now to get my hole started, to be able to cut into the center, I can just fold that fabric and just make a little hole. And then I can put my scissors in that hole and just follow along on that line there. Doesn't have to be perfect. You do just want it roughly in the center though. Just makes it easier in the next step. So now I'm coming up and cutting towards that corner as close as I can. A couple of threads away. I just need to get a sharper, pointier pair of scissors. The closer we can get, the better our little corners will be. Just going to grab a nice little sharp pair of scissors. Not the littlest pair of scissors, but I love these scissors. I'm used to using big scissors. These are my jack scissors. They've got a nice sharp point. Getting in. And then I'm going to come around and do the same thing again. So I'm coming up here, I'm going to cut into that corner. Making sure I don't snip those threads. There we go. So that's done. Now what we need to do basically is we need to get this facing, and we're going to tuck it through to the back here. Now before I do that, I'm just going to do a little finger press. Get a nice sharp crisp edge there. I can do the same on this side. A little finger press. You can see it's already starting to sit up, and I'll do the same on this edge. Turn it around, create that nice little crisp edge. Now I can tuck this in. So I usually start with those little short edges, tuck those in, turn this around the wrong way, so I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric. I'll focus on doing one of these sides sort of first, getting it out, and trying to sort of just get them lightly sitting down. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to finger press it first. Where that stitch line is, where the fold is there, I want to fold this fabric along there, but I want that seam to be not visible from the right side. I want to be able to see it from this side. So if it is easier for you, turn it up and just do a little bit of finger pressing. Even if it's pretty close right on that fold line, give it a quick little press. Helps just for it to stay in place a little there. You can see now it's already starting to want to fold along there. Now I'm going to come around and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just sort of holding this down at the same time, so I'm basically keeping it out of my way. Come along here, fold this over. I want to see that fold more towards the back of the fabric here, the back of the panel. I'm just giving that a little press. And this is what it's going to start to look like. If we've snipped nice and sharp into those corners, these corners will sit down and lay nice and flat for us. When we take it, we'll take this over to the iron and give it a press. Just going along, creating like a little memory sort of fold. Getting this little corner out so it sits nice, giving it a little press there. Pulling this corner out so it sits nice and sharp, and I'll give it a little press. So we've already got the startings of this happening. I'll bring you over to my ironing board and I'll show you how I would press that with my iron. Okay, so I've brought you over to my little pressing station here beside the machine. So I'm just folding those back. Now they've already got a little memory crease in them, so this is going to make pressing this quite easy. I'm going to start on these corners and get them to stay and lay nice and flat. That little part there is sitting pretty good, and this little part here is sitting nice. Get my iron, and I'm just going to sort of a little bit of steam, and I'm just holding my iron there to help set that in place. Can use my fingers just to hold that there. They're sitting beautiful and flat. I'm going to come over to this side. And I'm just going to get them to sit nice and flat while I'm at it. As nice and flat as I can. Bring this over a little bit better so you can see. So those little corners are already sitting nice and flat. So now I just need to go along and pushing this over so I can see that little seam there. That little fold is facing towards me, and I'm just going to shoot a bit of steam. My little iron here, I've got a Singer, it's like a continuous steam flow iron. I can actually just press a button and I've got continuous steam flowing. I love this iron. And the other beauty that I like about this iron is it doesn't turn itself off. So every time I come over to my pressing station, my iron is hot. Now, when I'm looking from where I am now, I can't actually see where that fold line is. So what I tend to like to do at times is I will turn this around so that I can see it. So now I can see that little fold line again. This side's sitting pretty nice and flat. I've just got to control this side here. Pressing that, give it a little roll so I can see it, and I'll give that a nice little press. Even if I just shoot a little bit of steam and just set my iron on there for a little while, will help set that in place. That noise you can hear in the background, or you might have heard it, that was my station for my iron, because it has its own steam station. There's no water in the actual iron. So there we go. This here's looking pretty good from the wrong side. Let's turn it over and see how we did from the right side. Sit them down. Looks pretty good to me. It doesn't even really need a press. I can just give that a little press. Sitting perfect on here as well. I'll hold that up and see if you can see. So you can see there, no fold lines visible from that side. And when I look to this side here, you can see the little fold line is just sitting to the wrong side. So that gives you a nice little window facing. It's all perfectly square, all sitting pretty. So now we'll move on to the next step and we will put our zipper in. Okay, we're back at the sewing machine. So there we go, our little window is beautifully done, ready to go. So we can just set that to the side for now. And what we're going to work on next is our zipper pocket lining. So I've got my zipper and it's a little longer than my pocket. So you can see here I can line up the cut edge of the zipper tape, and I've got probably about 1.5 inches hanging over here. I can pull my zipper pull. Let me go this way, get this on the right way. Just taking it towards that end. If I don't want to risk pulling the zipper pull off the end, there's a couple of things I can do. I can sew backwards and forwards across, or I can do a zigzag over the top of those teeth. So if I put those teeth in the middle underneath my presser foot and I do a zigzag stitch, and I'm going to do my zigzag stitch at the widest length my machine will do, and I'm just going to do some zigzags. How easy is that? So I've created like a little zipper stop. Not sure if you can see that there, but it ends up having to be that my tape's there, but I've got that there. I can take this zipper right up to that end there and it's not going to come off. So grab your first lining, zipper lining panel, and then your zipper, and we want to lay them both so they're facing right side up. Now I'm going to lay this zipper with this little raw edge here against the top raw edge of this, and I want to sew that on so that it's nice and straight. Change over to my zipper foot so that I can sew sort of a bit closer to the zipper teeth. I want to have like probably about a 1/4 inch away from those zipper teeth where I want to do this seam, so about a 1/4 inch away from this edge, roughly in the middle of this zipper tape. So I could use this foot here and I can just run that foot right along the edge of the zipper teeth there. Another option, if you don't have a zipper foot, is I could still use my presser foot. I can lay this standard presser foot up against those teeth, lining up my fabric first, up close to those teeth, and I can move my needle over. So that's another option that you can do so that you can sort of get close to your teeth. Ideally, if you've got a zipper foot, grab that out. Can actually just line up my zipper foot along the edge of the fabric here, but I will go a little bit closer. I'm going to line it up to the teeth. I'm going to do a little locking stitch because this is a seam that's staying in place. It's not a basting stitch. Now my main focus is not to stretch the zipper tape. We don't want to stretch it. We just want to help let it lay down on top of the fabric, and at the same time I just want to keep it lined up with the edge of this, my pocket lining. So it's pretty easy to do. If you just hold on to, put your fingers on top of that tape, you've got no chance or risk of stretching anything. I don't really recommend using pins or clips to hold this in place because it can distort it and you don't get a nice flat zip, which can lead to wavy zippers. We're trying to eliminate the risk of having wavy stitches. So again there, I'm just holding those teeth and I'll do a little locking stitch. So you can probably see my row of stitches there. Now what we're going to do, it's going to look wrong because what we're going to see from the pocket lining, because this is inside our pocket, we're going to see the wrong side of the zipper tape. This will be where we open the pocket. So when we open it and look inside, this is the fabric we're going to see. So we want to now pull this lining fabric down away. Our seam allowance is underneath there, so it's going away from the zipper tape, and we're just going to do a little finger press. Come from this side, give that another little press. If you feel you want to get this to sit a little bit flatter, you can get your iron and just give that a quick little press with the iron to get that to sit nice and flat. So now what I want to do is I want to determine, I want to get these fabrics laying the right way because I want my stripes going the right way. So that's the right way. There's my lining fabrics. They're facing together and my stripes are going the right way. So zipper pocket lining fabric up facing towards me. My zipper is facing right side up. I'm going to line up the fabric edges of my pocket across the sides here, get them nice and straight, and then I'm going to line up the top raw edge of the lining with the top edge of the zipper tape. Sorry. And I'm just going to stitch that in place using the same seam allowance that I did before. and we'll lock those stitches. Okay, so this is what it looks like now from the zipper side. We're going to open this up. So this is inside our pocket, and you can see there my stripes now are going in the same direction there. So it doesn't matter which side of the pocket you're looking at, it sort of looks seamless, sort of continuous. So again there, I've got to press that seam allowance. I've got the seam allowance going away from the zipper, lining fabric going away, and I'm just going to do a little finger press and get that fabric to sit down nice and flat. So that's inside. Now when I flip it over, I'm looking at where my zipper pull is. If you want to do a little bit of a press with your iron, you can go and do that now. Just give, even from this side here, just give this a little press along that crease there if you like. I'm going to get my lining panel with the window facing, and I'm going to lay that over the top so that I can see those teeth. You can use double-sided tape here if you like, but I tend to like the freedom of being able to adjust as I go. So I line up this facing piece here, so that was our little facing piece. That's roughly the same width as our lining fabric, so if I line that up there, line that up, that edge up, should be pretty much the same over here. Just center it. Now I want to get this zipper pull inside that window, so I'm just going to grab that zipper pull, bring it in a little bit. I don't want to open this all the way up, just a little, just enough to get that zipper in. I don't want this zipper pull to be sitting in the middle here because it'll create a bow where I want to sort of stitch. So I like it to stay up towards this end, and I'll just place that zipper there. So that's in place. That zipper also helps me center this. So that's centered. All I need to focus on with this fabric is just centering it over that zipper, because I've got a nice flat crisp little window. Get my pull out, and then I can determine where I'm going to start sewing. I'm not going to start sewing up here. Generally I like to start sewing sort of down the bottom of the zipper, and then I'll come around, up, and then I'll move this zipper pull back, go around and finish off. So I'm just going to start, actually I'm coming this way and what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust my presser foot so that I am sewing closer to the edge of this zipper tape. And keeping that nice and centered, I just see a little bit of that zipper tape there. Looks pretty good. I'm going to move my needle over, and I'm just going to bring it down just slightly so I can see where that's going to land. Looks pretty good. Now I'm just going to bring this over so the edge of this zipper foot is running along the edge of this fabric. Needle down, that's secured in place, and all I need to do now is just keep this fabric running sort of a consistent distance away from these zipper teeth and have my zipper foot following along on that edge of that fabric. I'm not going to do a locking stitch to start with. If you need to stop and adjust, do so. Things are looking pretty good here. Go as fast or as slow as you're comfortable with. Now I'm coming up closer to that zipper pull. Sometimes, depending on the size of the window, I may be able to sew past that, but in this case, just going to lift that up, just sort of wedging those teeth a little bit closer together. I don't want them butted right up, because when I open or close this zipper back here, that needs to have that little bit of a gap for that end there to sit nice. Now I'm going to go about 1 or 2 stitches past where that edge of this window is. Turn around, have a look. Looks pretty good. Yep, looking good. So now I'm just going to come over. Seeing where that needle is. I think I may need to come over one more stitch. No, I was spot on. So I'm going to stitch down a little bit and then I'm going to put my zipper pull back and continue on. Lift my foot up and just pull that zipper pull back up there. Just adjust to make sure this is sitting nice and flat. Again there, my zipper foot is still running along the edge of that fold of the fabric. Can adjust a little again. I'm not actually watching my needle, I'm watching the edge of this foot along the edge of this fabric. The needle's going to sew and do what it needs to do. I just need to steer it in the right direction. Just going to trim this little thread tail. Just get that all sitting all nice and flat. And one stitch over there. Turn around, looking pretty nice. I'll just check where that needle landed. Oh, pretty good. It's lined up right along the edge of that fold of the fabric, so I can just keep going. I'm going to go over my stitches where I started, just by about 2 or 3 stitches, and then I might just do 1 or 2 little back stitches. And come over. And I'll do 1 stitch forward there. Cut my threads. And there's our zipper is set in. Now when we turn this to the wrong side, the fabric, let that fabric, so we were sewing with everything open like that. I'm now going to trim these threads from the wrong side because I don't want these tails hanging on the wrong side. So you can see there the stitches from where I sewed that in. Now we can let the pocket pieces fall down. They're falling down. Just hold that there. Now what I'm going to do next is we're going to sew along the sides here and close up the sides of the pocket. Now if you are doing a reversible bag with the zipper pocket, I'm going to leave the opening here in the bottom of this zipper to turn the bag right side out. If we were doing a tote without a zipper pocket, we're going to leave an opening, which I'll show you when we get to that stage, in the top. So we're going to leave this zipper pocket open, but what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to trim the bottom of this zipper pocket so that they're both the same length. I can just use my scissors and they're lined up pretty much the same there. Now to sew down the sides here, because we don't want to sew on our main panel, I'm going to flip this to the right side, pull this fabric back, and there is my zipper lining pieces. Just keep that all out of the road. That's our little facing there, and there's our zipper pocket. We're going to trim this pocket down afterwards, but I don't want to trim this facing. I like to leave this facing longer so it's like a staggered cut edge, so I don't have just a sudden blunt bulky cut edge from this side of the fabric. This little facing acts like a facing and helps sort of smooth down the bumps in those layers. Hopefully that makes sense. Now I can change back to a regular presser foot now. I'll just put that one back on. Might as well take advantage when you're using a domestic sewing machine. Take advantage of everything you've got. I've just set my stitch length back to a standard stitch length. In this case, I've been using a stitch length of 2.4. So I am going to sew down here, and but when I trim, I'm not trimming this bit here. When I'm sewing, I can even catch this little tail here. I can put my foot over that little edge there if I want to get closer, or I can have my foot running along the edge here, and I can move my needle over a bit. You don't need to catch this. Some people say, oh, it makes it extra strong and it stops it coming out. It's already pretty strong there. We've got the zipper stitched down, we've got a window facing that's already been stitched and turned, and then it is top stitched. There really is no need to have to stitch over that little flangey bit there. So I'm just going to run my foot along the side here, do a couple of locking stitches, go over those zipper teeth, and just keep this seam as fairly straight as you can. Get to the end here, and I definitely want to back stitch because I'm going to be putting in turning the bag through this opening here. So I've back stitched all the way up, like give it a good little bit of a back stitch. Now for this side, I'm going to turn this around. Oops, I just moved the camera, but it still looks all right. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to line up so I've got that fairly straight, line up my presser foot, and I'm going to sew all the way down here. Lock those stitches at the beginning and the end there. And come up. Over those zipper teeth and lock those stitches in place. Yeah, that's all I needed to do. A little bit off there. Now, let's have a look. Pockets closed on both sides. It's our facing there. We are now just going to trim off this bit of zipper tape, but I don't want to cut that bit of facing there. I don't even need to cut off any of this pocket lining. Oh, I might cut a bit off down here because it may go into my seam allowance. I'm just holding that facing back at the end there, so now I've got like a stagger here. Even just a 1/4 inch or so seam allowance is enough down the bottom. It's just a side seam for the pocket. So that's got rid of those. You can do this side here. Okay, now I don't want to trim off that facing. Like if you do trim it off, it doesn't really matter, but just try not to. Won't make a huge difference, just a little touch. And I'm just trimming down. And I've got rid of that. So now there's my pocket done. Do you need to seal those edges of the zipper? No, you do not. It's no way that zipper tape is going to fray past all of the different layers of stitching that is in there. So that's your zipper pocket done. Look inside, and there is our gorgeous striped fabric, and when we open it up like that, I've got matching stripes, so they look coordinated. All our edges are all nicely finished, so we don't see any of the edges of that zipper tape in there. We close that up. It looks really pretty. Okay, so in the next step of the bag, what we're going to be doing is sewing, preparing and sewing our slip pocket, and then we'll be attaching it to our panel where we've chosen to put our slip pocket. In this case, I'm classing this as my lining, and we're going to be making a center mark and a mark down from the top, which actually is 4 inches. All the measurements are in your pattern. So we will then have our pocket pieces. So if you've got a directional print, you will want your print facing up, and then on one of these I've done the markings here to show you a look, so you can see we will be leaving an opening here at the bottom of the pocket. Now we're going to be doing 1/2 inch seam allowances. Okay, so we're ready to begin sewing our slip pocket. So we've got our openings here, so I'm going to start here and sew across there. I'm using actually a smaller stitch length just to help me get nice crisp little edges and corners there. I'm using a stitch length of 2. So I'm going to start at my opening, my presser foot down, needle down, and then I will pivot at this corner here. I'll do a couple of back stitches just to lock that and secure that in place. And I'm going to sew right off the edge. A couple of locking stitches. Now here's my little tip to help us get nice sharp little corners without having to do much work. Where we've just sewn that stitch line, if we fold the fabric right against that stitch line, nice crisp little edge, good little finger press, and now we're going to stitch, do a little back stitch, and then we'll continue sewing down here. So again there, right at that edge, a couple of locking stitches, sew off the edge, a couple of locking stitches, snip my threads. You can see as well I've got pins here to help prevent my fabric from moving, and they're away from my seams, and I've put them in pointing out so I don't have any risk of running over like my pin heads. Now we're going to do the same thing we did before, where we've done that stitch line. There's our stitches, just create a nice crisp little corner edge, and we will sew down once again, and we're just going to repeat that all the way around. Once again, fold along those little stitching lines. And repeat again, but we're only going to be sewing this time to here, and then we're going to pivot and come off, and that will leave our opening for us. Fold that again, nice crisp little edge. And because I've made that little marking, we know that the bottom edge of this pocket will be nice and straight when we turn it and close it up. And we're done. So we can take out our pins, and we're going to be turning this pocket right way out. Now you can go to the iron and just give these a little press. Give them a finger press if you like. Sometimes giving them a little press with the iron just helps get them nice and crisp. I'm just doing, this is how I do a finger press. So for finger pressing, just fold up that edge. Give it a nice crisp line. Even across here where our opening is, fold it up where that stitching, these stitching lines are. Just give that a little press. Okay, let's turn our little bag right side out. So we can help our little corners here. If we fold those down, I'm putting my thumb inside, got it along that corner there, and I can just poke that little corner out, and I've already got a beautiful sharp corner. If I hold that on there, you'll see we've got a lovely corner there already. So again there, I'll poke my thumb in. You can see where I've got that fold. Give that little fold over, press it out, and we've got a lovely sharp corner. And we haven't even done anything yet. All we've done is turn that out. And the beauty too of not snipping into those corners is we've got a lovely strong corner we don't have to worry about the risk of ever poking a hole through that corner or anything like that. It'll stay lovely and strong. Poke him out. Just get them out so we can get them nice and crisp after as well, but you can see that's already a lovely corner. My thumb in here, or my finger, thumb or finger, one of them. Poke him out. Nice sharp little corner already. Now we can just turn this whole pocket right side out. We can see these edges already look great. And we haven't even had to do anything, haven't even poked out the corners. But if you want to poke out your corners, you can. But I find sometimes just giving this fabric even just a little wriggle like that, you'll get that corner to pop out. Little wriggle, and you'll get a nice sharp corner. They're all looking really good. This one looks like it needs to come out a little more. I might even be able to just push that out with my finger. Looking pretty good already. That looks really good. So I like to just give that seam, these seams, just a little roll. And then we can give them a press with the iron. And when we press with the iron, because we did that little row of stitches where we stitched in, makes it really easy then to just push those in. There's no strained stitches or anything here on the ends. Line them up. Little finger press, and you can see perfectly straight. So I'll just go and give that a press and I'll be back. Okay, so I've given my pocket a lovely little press, and this here is the opening here end of my pocket. So everything's all tucked in nicely in there. So what I want to do on the top of my pocket is I want to do a nice little row of top stitching. Just sort of helps give it a nice little finish across the top there before we attach it to the bag. So now when you're doing a row of top stitching, if you've used an interfacing for your pocket and wanted a little bit more of a structured pocket like I have, you might find you've got a thickness here. Now what you can do is you can use like a hump jumper just to help your machine get over that little hump there. Just start just over the edge a little bit. I will increase my stitch length to a 3. I might just go to a 3. Put my needle down and I'll just sew a couple of stitches, just starting right near the edge there. A couple of little locking stitches. Now here I can see that my needle doesn't want to, my foot doesn't want to go up, so I've just pressed that down to lock that into place there. So you can see now it's not sitting on the bed of the machine at the back, and it will help it get through. So I have got quite a little bit of bulk there. If you don't use an interfacing, you won't have as much bulk. Stitches, and I'll do a little locking stitch there and just snip my threads. So that's just given me a nice little bit of top stitching there. Let's see if you can see that. Here we go. You can see there I've just got a nice little row of top stitching, and I'll snip that thread from the beginning. Here we go. They're done. One little thread there, snip them off. You get into the habit of snipping your threads as you go, you'll get a nice neat bag. So I'll grab my lining panel. So I've got my lining panel, I've got my markings here already, so I just need to find the center of my pocket, and I can easily do that just by folding the pocket in half, creating a little crease. If you find it hard to keep track, or you can make a little mark with a pen, or you can just pop a pin in there, and that'll help line that up. So I can just line up that pin with that center, line up the top edges of my pocket with that line, and then I know it's installed nice and straight. So they're lined up there. Now I'll put a couple of pins in just to secure that in place. Now when I put my pins in, I come from the inside, pin towards the outside. My pins won't get in the road when I'm sewing, and I can just take them out when I'm finished sewing my pocket. I might as well use that. I don't need that centre mark there anymore. And my pocket should stay nicely in place. So there's the bottom of my panel. There's the opening. So double check that, because you don't want to sew your pocket on upside down or have your opening at the side. Now let's get this done. I'm going to come down. I'm going to use a stitch of about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. I'm going to come down and start down a little bit further, and I'll just lock that presser foot in place. Now this is where I can use a hump jumper. If you don't have a hump jumper, you can just use a piece of scrap of fabric, and you can fold that up and put that underneath your foot. That also works as well. So we'll see how we go. Needle down, stitch length still of 3. I'll do a couple of back stitches. I want to go right up to over the edge of this pocket, and that will just secure that. I'll come forward a couple of stitches, and I will go back again there just to give that a really good secure. Like no chance of that thing accidentally getting ripped out. And all I need to do now is just try and keep this seam allowance, your top stitching about the same distance, whatever you choose. Don't go so close to the edge where you think you might fall off. Turn around and I will keep going. And this now is where my opening is. So we want to make sure that we catch both layers of that opening. Get that through there. Coming up to that corner again, and I'll just pivot. So now when I finish here, because this is the top edge of my pocket, I'm going to make sure I come just over the edge of the top of the pocket, and then back stitch, and I'll come up and I'll do that again, and I'll back stitch again, just to make sure that's nice and secure. Now I'll get my threads at the beginning here. Because I used my thread cutter, my threads are pulled through to the back already. There's our opening, and you'll see there that little top stitching there. It's just come over that tip, so that's nice and secure, and I've done that on both sides. So we can take out our pins, and our slip pocket is done. There we go. It looks really cute. I really like that. Now it's a lovely big roomy slip pocket, so you can fit heaps inside this tote. Fit a notepad or whatever you want to do in that. Now I don't recommend you making this pocket any bigger than the measurements that I have in the pattern. You can make it smaller if you like, but I don't recommend going any bigger, because we do need to box the bottom of the bag, and we don't want this pocket sort of coming around the sides. So there we go. I'll see you in the next video. Okay, in the next step of the sew along, what we're going to be doing is making our straps. So you will have your pattern pieces or your measurement chart for the measurements of your straps, and you can choose to interface your straps. If you just want soft straps, you can eliminate the interfacing. For these particular straps, I've used a non-woven interfacing. It helps eliminate any stretch in those straps and makes them nice and strong, and also reduces the bulk in the straps. Here you can see I've joined two little pieces that I had. Saves waste and makes no difference in the overall end result of your straps. Now, to fold your straps, there's a couple of options here you can do. You can simply, once this is laid out flat, just bring these long raw edges together, line them up, and use your iron and just give that a press. Then open this back out and you'll have a crease running down along the centre. Then you can just bring these raw edges up to meet just shy of that centre line. Give that a press and that will give you a nice crease along here. Bring in the opposite side, meet it up. I like to leave about 1/8 of an inch gap in between. What that does is it helps this fold over nicely. So it allows for the depth of the fold. So when you look at that, you've got that depth there. So leaving that crease, that gap along that crease, gives you a nice crisp folded edge there. And it'll fold easily along that line. Now you can choose, if you like, to keep these in place. You can add some couple of pins. That helps eliminate the fabric from shifting. If you're going to apply pins, I recommend attaching them in this angle here. This will hold these two layers together and eliminate any shifting, so they will stay lined up nicely. You can see there's no movement there. If you use clips, which is if your fabric's particularly thick or you're using vinyl or something like that, you can use clips to hold them. Clips won't necessarily eliminate the fabric from shifting. As you can see, I can still easily slide that fabric around. So if you have trouble with keeping your fabric lined up, use pins. Another option that you can use are these magnetic little holders. They're from Hemline. They come in a packet of 3. I'll grab the packaging there. So they're from Hemline, and it will hold thicker fabrics together without using any pins. But to use these, you've got a magnetic backing, you've got a backing, metal backing, you've got 3 really strong thin magnets. So what you can do, if you like, fold those together, just helps sort of hold them in place. Place that on. I like to use this little rough textured side of the metal backing plate, give a little bit more grip, and that will just help hold that in place. They come in a little packet of 3. They're quite strong, like you'll find that they're quite good and strong. The backing, like if you're worrying that they're going to attach to your machine, the backing of that metal there is not magnetic. So when you're sewing along, they're not going to stick to the metal base of your machine. So I can just attach these, put one there, put one on the back, and that will help hold that in place as well. Just another little idea. So what we're going to do is where the fabric is folded, I'll just take this off. You can see it's really strong. Very, very strong. So we're going to fold these together with this folded edge. We're going to stitch all the way down, right along through to the end of the strap. And we're going to use a stitch width from this folded edge between 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit wider if you're worried that you're going to fall off the edge. But generally we use 1/8 of an inch away from this folded edge. So we do that side first, and then we'll come back and we will do the second side of stitching down here. So we'll go over to the sewing machine and we will stitch our straps. Another tip there, just make sure that your straps are the same length. So it'll sit better and you'll eliminate the risk of like one strap continually falling off your shoulder. If you're a little bit concerned there, when you do your top stitching, just sort of start about 1/8 of an inch from the edge there, do both the straps and just check. These little raw edges, no need to stitch across those raw edges if you don't want to. These will be going into the seam of our bag, so you can just do straight stitching. Do a little locking stitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, we'll head on over to the sewing machine. Okay, so we're going to sew down our straps. So we've got everything folded as we've shown in the previous step of the video. Fold these towards the center and we are stitching down first this folded edge of the fabric. I'm using a top stitching length on these ones. I'm doing a stitch length of 3. You could do a stitch length of 3.5 if you like. It's just I'm being sort of consistent. I chose a 3.3 millimeter stitch length in my top stitching in another section of the bag, so I'm going to just stay consistent throughout this bag. So I'm placing my needle down, and I'm just going to find a point along my plate here. I've got a 1/8 of an inch guide on my bed of my machine here, so I'm just going to line up the edge of that fabric along that 1/8 of an inch mark, and that should help me keep a fairly consistent width of seam. Little locking stitch at the beginning and the end, and all I'm doing is I'm not watching that needle, I'm just watching this 1/8 of an inch mark here on the bed of my machine, and I'll just hold that in place and feed that through. I'm moving my fingers along, I'm not pushing or pulling, I'm just helping guide that through. Now I've got a pin here. As we can see, the pressure of my foot is starting to create a little bit of a bubble. So if I hadn't had a pin there, that would have pushed this fabric down and it would have kept going, and the little pushing bit would get worse as I went along. What I can do is I can use a sewing awl, or in this case I've got my little tool here which is like an awl as well. What I can do is I can help lay this fabric down flat, and I will just help feed that through so that I've eliminated the risk of this strap getting puckers as I'm coming along. Now everything's lined up again there. I can take that pin out, and I've reduced the risk of this getting stretched out further as I went along. I can help sort of keep this in place with my fingers as I'm going along. Didn't have any pushing there. Sometimes it can just be the tension from our presser foot. Everything's feeding in there nice and smoothly. Coming to the end, and I will just lock those stitches. So there we can see our top stitching. Looks nice from this side. Have a look at the back, and it looks lovely from the wrong side as well. So now what we're going to do is we're going to stitch down the opposite side. You can see there I've got no warping or twisting of my strap. Everything is sitting and laying nice and flat. So I can come down, and I'm doing the same thing again, following that 1/8 of an inch mark and helping make sure that this feeds through nice and smoothly. A couple of locking stitches. Towards the end, and I'll do a couple of locking stitches and cut my threads, and there's our strap. So we've got top stitching on both sides, and it's nice and neat. Bring that up closer for you, and we've got no puckering or twisting or warping in that strap. So it looks really, really good, and it's a nice strong strap as well. And then I'll just repeat that for the second strap, and I'll see you in the next video. In this next step, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be attaching our straps to, you can choose to either attach the straps to your exterior panels or your lining panels. The main thing is just make sure that you're attaching the straps to the same panels. Now, what we want to do is we want to find, so you'll have your 2 straps and your 2 linings or your 2 exterior pieces. Now we want to find the center marks on these panels. The easiest way to do that is if you just grab your pieces and fold them together. You can do mark your center a couple of different ways. You can just line up those edges and place a little crease, make a little snip if you like to find that point, or you can make a mark either with a friction pen or an air raising pen, giving that a little crisp little crease. So now I can easily find my center mark, and I'm just going to place a little mark there so that I can find that center. Now from the centers we want to measure out 3.5 inches. So I've just got a little ruler here. So from 3.5 inches from each side of that center mark. So if I place my ruler at this little mark here, go over to my 3.5 inches, and I can place a mark there. Then I can do the same on this side. I'm just going to place my ruler on that 3.5 inch mark and place a mark there. This way then we're leaving a 7-inch gap between the handles, our straps. I'll just take this one out of the way. You'll repeat that for that same panel there. I'll just move that over there. So now with your straps, have them laying out nice and flat. I like to put my folded edge to the inside, or so that's where you've got your double fold there, or you can just do that single folded edge. The main thing is just be consistent. So I'm going to have that fold over edge where I've got the two little seams there. I'm putting them to the outside, whichever way you like. Now what we want to do is you can either clip, so you can place a clip there, keeping this strap flat so it doesn't get twisted. I'm then going to place this strap on the outside of the mark on this side. You can, if you want to use a pin, you can place a pin. I'll just place a pin like that, and that will secure that in place. So a pin or a clip, whatever's easier for you. And what we're going to do is we're just going to baste, using about 1/8 of an inch away, baste this to secure it in place so it doesn't move on us. You could do 1/4 of an inch. We've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this bag, so you've got plenty of room there. And we'll do that to both straps. So just double check, make sure nothing is twisted. So if you were to press this strap down, everything should lay nice and flat with no twists in there. So just repeat that and do that for the second panel. Again there, fold this in half, find that center mark. Got my little crease there. I can use my pen to make that mark. Move this out of the road so I've got a nice flat surface. It's my center coming out 3.5 inches, making another mark. If you find it hard to find when you're on a busy print, just make that mark a little longer. I'll grab that ruler again, lining that up on that 3.5 inch mark, and I will place another mark there. Grab my second strap. Now the main thing is to be consistent. So if I've got whichever folded edge I've got on this strap, I will do the same for this one. So I've got just that little single fold on the inside, and I will place that there and pin or clip in place, keeping that strap nice and flat, no twists. Lay that down and place it again there on the outside of that mark. And then we'll go to the machine and we can baste those in place. Now while we're at the machine, we're going to baste these straps in place, and then we're going to do our first joining seam. So we're going to repeat this same procedure for our lining and our exterior. So after you've basted your straps in place, what we're going to do is we're going to sew this bottom seam in place first. Now we're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you find it easier, you can draw a line and so that you can follow that seam. So we want these to be consistent on both the exterior and the lining. So that's putting our two exterior pieces together. Then we'll get our two lining pieces. Just grabbing my linings, move those to the side, and we're going to do the same thing. Line these up, and we're going to sew these seams together. Now you can place pins at either end. So line up the first end and then come down, line up this bottom edge. This ensures that everything sits and lines up perfectly. If you give that a little tug, that will evenly distribute that out, and your edges are probably fairly closely lined up. So line up those raw edges if they're not quite lined up, and place a pin or a clip in the center there. And then we will sew this seam. So we'll head on over to the sewing machine and we'll do that. Okay, so we're back at the sewing machine and we're going to baste down our straps. And we're going to do this for both panels. So to do our basting stitch, we've got our little strap on the outside of this mark. I can just line up my presser foot, and I'm just going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm using just a regular stitch length of 2.4. Doesn't need to be long stitches. I want to know that this strap is securely placed inside this seam allowance. I'll do a locking stitch. I'm going back over the end of the strap and I'll go back. I know that that strap now is securely attached and it's not coming anywhere. Doing the same again. There's that little marking I made previously, lining up that strap, lining up the top edges, and I will do my stitching. I can just go over and I can just go straight back. That strap is now securely attached and in place. So it's not going to move or shift on me, and I'm just going to repeat that for the second side. Over here, just make sure it's nice and straight, because we don't want our straps to be crooked, so we want to keep this nice and straight. I'm just going to take that pin out and secure that in place. So they're all lined up. Now what we want to do is, with our lining or our exterior, because we need to do this with both, we want to get the bottom of our bag. So this is the section with the cutouts. We want to line up these edges together. Line up these raw edges, get them nice and straight across here and across the bottom. So I can place a pin or a clip, secure that in place. I'm going to come down to the bottom edge, line up this edge. This will ensure that if our pattern piece is slightly bigger or slightly smaller on one side or the other, we'll be able to make sure that we're starting these at the same places. We'll be able to pull that and evenly distribute any variation that might be, because it might be just out by like 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch or something like that. Just getting them in place. Now got those nice and straight, I can come to the center, lining up these edges, and I'll place a pin. And we're going to sew using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just remove your straps out of the way. So if your straps are in the way, get them out, just pull them to the side. Have everything laying nice and flat before you start. So we're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Line up my fabric on the 1/2 inch mark. On my bed of my machine, I've got a guide here at a 1/2 inch. I can find the corresponding mark on my machine here. So all I need to focus on is keeping this fabric lined up on that 1/2 inch mark. I'm going to put my needle down, take my pin out, and I'm just going to back stitch. I've come in a bit far, but that's all right. I want this nice and secure, and I'm just going to continue sewing. Making sure that my edges of the fabric are all still lined up nice and even. Got a bit of gust of wind coming through the windows. And I'll take that pin out and I'll reverse to lock those stitches in place. Now what we want to do is we want to do that for the for the other part of the bag. Oh, I was looking for my lining. I thought I brought it over and I couldn't find it, but here I do the same thing, and I'm going to sew the bottom of my lining as well. And then we're going to head over to the ironing board after we've done this. So again there, 1/2 inch seam allowance, lining up my fabric, needle down, reverse. That keeps that nice and secure in place, keeping these edges lined up. And lock those stitches. So you can give that a little press if you like first, but what we want to do is fold this out so it's nice and flat, and we want to press these seams open. The beauty of having a 1/2 inch seam allowance is it makes it really easy to fold those out, and you've got no risk of any seams pulling apart, fabric fraying and things like that. So we want to press those with the iron so they sit nice and flat. Now if you want to add a little bit more structure and to stop these from curling up, what you can do after you've pressed these, or at least finger press them, is from the right side, if we turn this over, what we can do is make sure that these seam allowances are sitting out nice and flat, and we can do a row of top stitching that will ensure that those seam allowances always stay nice and flat, especially if we're going to be reversing the bag inside and out. So what we can do is we can sew a seam, because we've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I suggest doing a top stitching 1/4 of an inch away from this seam, and that will ensure that that seam allowance underneath will stay nice and flat. So to do that, all we need to do is, I'm going to use a little mark on my presser foot, which is 1/4 inch. Main thing is we just want each side of the top stitching to be the same. I'm going to switch over to a stitch length of 3, which is what I've been using for my top stitching. I'll do a couple of stitches just to lock that in place, and all I need to do is, using this mark on my presser foot, I'm going to use that to follow along. Now this fabric is probably going to get in your road and might cause you to sew crooked seams. Just roll that up so that it's out of your road and doesn't get caught in the bed of your machine. All I'm focusing on is keeping this mark on my presser foot, following along on that line, and making sure that my seam allowance is open. And I'll lock those stitches at the end, just a couple of stitches. Now I've got no risk of this sitting like the seams flipping up. So if I flip over, you can see that will flip up. This now is going to stay down nice and flat. So I'm going to repeat that on this other side. I'm using the same marking on my presser foot so that my top stitching looks consistent. A couple of stitches, lock them, and I'm just going to follow through. I'm going to roll this fabric up again so it's out of my road. Get this so it's all laying nice and flat, making sure that seam allowance is flat underneath. Snip this little thread off. And a couple of locking stitches. Now you can see this is all nice and flat, and when I turn it over, my seam allowances are sitting down. No matter what I do, those seam allowances are going to stay nice and flat inside my bag. Especially when we're looking down in the bottom of our bags, it's nice to see a nice flat seam. Now I will go over to the machine and I'll get to the ironing station. I'll give that a quick press, but before I do that, I'm going to do the same thing for the exterior. So I'm getting my exterior. To help even, another way you can help get these open is if I just pull one of these apart, this seam allowance, flip this side up, run my finger along. That will also help keep that seam allowance open. Flip it over, and if I do, knock the camera, sorry about that. It's not easy sewing with the camera right in front of you. I can fold this open and give this another little finger press as well. And I'm going to do the same thing, get this out nice and flat. You'll be able to see the top stitching really well on this one. Now make sure that these seam allowances are open. I like to go through and make sure they're open all the way through. This is whereas if you used your iron and went and gave this a press, this would already be sitting nice and flat. I'm just putting my fingers in so you can see what I'm doing. Putting my fingers in and opening this up. You can see there that's becoming nice and flat. Give that a little press with my fingers, making sure it's open all the way through. Coming through. I can use my fingernails and just get this nice and flat. So I'm open all the way through. You can see there. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. Just checking to see if I had enough thread in my bobbin. Just get this thread under my presser foot. Now I'm going to use that same marking on my presser foot here, and the same stitch length, top stitching length of 3. Do a couple of stitches, lock that in place. I don't want the risk of my top stitching threads coming undone and being exposed on the right side of my bag when it's turned out, so I like to always still do a couple of little locking stitches to lock my top stitching in place. Now we'll just sew along. I'm going to fold this fabric up, get it out of my road. Making sure that that seam allowance is still open and flat underneath. And I'll lock that in place. Threads. And there's our first row of top stitching. You can see it does help make that seam a little more structured as well. So I'm going to do the same for this side. Move this fabric out of the road, make sure there's nothing sitting underneath. Locking stitches and continue sewing. Making sure this is still all nice and flat. And lock those stitches. And there's my 2 rows of top stitching done. So that's what will be seen in the bottom of the bag. So we're going to repeat this same step on our lining as well as our exterior. So what we're doing is we're going to bring the right sides of the bag together. We're going to line up these side seams. Now when you've done the pieced panel, I'll share with you because we want to try and make sure that we can get these to line up as best as we can. So to start with, I am going to line up the top and the bottom, and then we'll see if we need to make any adjustments as we go. For this one I am going to use pins because I don't want this fabric shifting on me, so I'm going to place a pin near the top, keeping these raw edges lined up, and I'm going to place a pin at the bottom, and I want these corners here to line up. So I will place a pin here. So now I know that my top and my bottom is lined up. Give that a little pull, get them edges lined up nicely. I will place a pin here for now. I may need to adjust it. We'll just see how well we lined up these seams. So I need to make sure that where the seam allowance is going to be, so my stitching line is going to be in at a 1/2 inch. I need to make sure that these edges line up together near that 1/2 inch mark, which looks like I've done a pretty good job. So I'm going to place a pin. Might not be perfect on the other side, we'll see how we go. Going to place a pin just before and just after, and hopefully this will help keep this from shifting when we sew this seam allowance. Remember, the pins are the most stable to help prevent shifting of fabric. So let's have a look now at this opposite side. So again there, I'm going to line up my bottom edges, get this corner laid up, not lined up, nice and straight, and I'll place a pin. Which way have I got my pins going? I am going to be sewing probably from this way, so I can place them on this side. Let's have a look. We'll line up that top edge, get these all nice and straight, place a pin. I can lay this down, give that a little tug. That will evenly distribute that fabric. I'll place a pin here. Let's have a look and see how we're going. Get them nice and taut. Pull this back. I am off a little bit here, so I'll bring this up close so that you can see this one here. So I need to just bring that over ever so slightly. Now they're lined up pretty good. I'm going to hold that in place and I'll put in a pin right up close to that edge. That will help eliminate that from shifting. I'm just going to double check in here. They look pretty good. I'll place a pin right up close. So that should help eliminate this from shifting, and it'll end up pretty even. If it's out a smidgen, that's not too bad. So all we need to do now is we're going to sew down this side using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and again on this side using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we need to do the same thing with our lining, or whichever your other opposite panel is. This instance I don't have anything to match up across these sides because there's no decorative strip, so all I need to do is line up my top edge, line up my bottom edge, make sure that's nice and straight. For this one I can even just use clips because I don't have anything that needs to be as precise. Pop a clip there. If you find it easier, make sure this is lined up. Get a hold of those ends, give it a little tug to make sure it's evenly distributed, and just place as many clips or pins as you feel necessary. Get these up the right way. And I'll do the same for this side. Get these edges all lined up nice and straight. They're lined up. Place a pin or a clip. And we can do the same for this bottom edge. We want this lined up. Get them lined up nice and even. If you've got these little frayed little threads, just snip them off. Pull them out. Depends on the fabric. I just like to get them out of the road. Place a clip. Again there, give that a little tug. Get them so that they're nice and evenly distributed. I can walk my fingers towards the centre. Place a clip, and I can head over to the sewing machine now and sew down the side seams on my lining and on my exterior, vice versa. So the main thing is we're going to sew these side seams, and then once we've sewn those, we're going to actually press those seams open so that they're nice and flat. I'll meet you over at the sewing machine. Okay, so we're back over at the sewing machine, and I'm going to be doing my side seams on my pieced panel with that decorative strip on the inside. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start from the bottom and then come down and finish this side seam. The reason I'm not starting at the top is you can see this is a much bigger gap. If there's any chance that this fabric is going to shift and I lose alignment, I've got a bigger risk of that happening along this long section than I have on this short section. So I'm actually going to start from the bottom and work my way up. Now I'm using a regular stitch length on my machine, that's a 2.4, and I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I am going to back stitch at the beginning and end. Now I want to make sure that these are perfectly lined up across the top and across the bottom. I'm coming in a little, lining that side up. I've got a little marking here on my machine for the 1/2 inch mark. I'm going to back stitch, get those stitches nice and secure, and then I'm just going to come along. I've got a pin here and I've got a pin here, so that should help eliminate any shifting. I'll remove that pin as I go, making sure that this seam here from where I joined the two panels is sitting nice and flat on the bottom. And I'm sort of holding this with my fingers, and I'm just keep going. Coming up to that pin, I'll remove that pin, go over. I've got a pin afterwards as well, so I'll take that out, and now I'm just going to continue stitching all the way to the end. Making sure these edges are lined up nice and square at the top and along the sides. Just going to snip off these frayed little threads here from the fabric. I'll take this pin out, and I'll lock my stitches at the end there. Snip my threads. Let's have a look and see how well we did with lining up this decorative strip. So if I open this up, we can see that everything has stayed in place and nothing has shifted. So now I'm going to repeat that for the opposite side. Now I've got that long seam there again and the short seam. I'm going to start from the bottom again. So I'm going to flip this up, make sure everything's lined up nice and straight at the top here, nice and straight at the sides. You've got straps inside here if you basted your straps in. I'm just making sure, pushing them out of the road, so this is all nice and flat all the way through. Now lining up again on that 1/2 inch seam, I can drop my needle down, take that pin out, and I'll do a back stitch to lock that in place. Come on down. Now again there, this should stay in place. I've got that pin there. Need to make sure that this fabric doesn't flip over as I'm sewing. When we've got like a bed on our machine, that fabric can get caught and flip over, so when I get past this seam gets past here, I will double check before I sew over it. So I've come over, I'm just going to check, and yes, they're still nice and flat. Now I've got my pin here, no fabric bunching up there. I'll just keep going, take that pin out, keep doing my seam allowance, take that pin out. So fingers crossed everything stayed in place. Just pulling those little straps out of the way from underneath, and I'm going to continue all the way up to the top. Take the pin out. Everything's still all nice and straight, and I'll lock those stitches. Now let's have a look, see how we did with lining up these edges. Open this up, and it looks pretty good. Might be like a smidgen out, but that's not enough for me to worry about unpicking it and going again. It's like probably like maybe a 1/16 of an inch, if that. That's pretty good. If anyone's looking at the side of my bag that closely, they're too close. Let's get rid of any little frayed edges there. Okay, now we're just going to repeat that for the lining. I don't have anything that I have to worry about here lining up. I just want to make sure I don't get my pocket or anything caught in my seam allowance, and I am lined up at the top and at the side, and I'm doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Needle down, reverse, that side, and now I'll flip this around and do the opposite side. Okay, and there, making sure everything's lined up nice and square at those corners. Nearly pulled my thread out. 1/2 inch seam allowance, needle down, reverse, and keep sewing. Just make sure everything's lined up. Remember I was saying you've got the risk of fabric shifting with clips? I have noticed I've got a little bit of shifting here. So I'm going to use my little helping hand here somewhere. Because I've got like just an ever so slightly little bubble. Just going to get this to lay nice and flat. What I like about this one is I've got 2 fingers helping guide that through. And we're looking pretty good. Coming up to the end here, I want these to line up nicely. Just make sure that they're lining up pretty good. Easing that fabric in. And we'll do a reverse. Snip those threads. So you can see there where I had that little bit of fabric excess. Whereas when I was sewing with the pins, I didn't have any of that. So now we've got our 2 side seams done. Okay, so for the next section of the sew along, what we're going to be doing is we want to press these side seams open and flat. And I thought I'd just share a couple of different options on how you can easily do that. So depending on what tools and gadgets you have in your sewing supplies. Now I'll show you first off if all you've got is an iron. So what we can do, now before I fold back these side seams, what I like to do is I like to give them a good press. Just to set those seams, get them nicely done. Now we'll move these shoulder straps out of the way. So pull them out. And if we just grab this part of the tote and pull this side seam over into this section of the back, then what we can do is we can finger press these seams open so that they're sitting nice and flat. You want them to feel like they're really smooth and flat. That way then we know there's no sort of little puckers or anything underneath there, all the way down to the bottom. Now if we get our iron and we bring our iron in, let me just make a little bit of room here, get my iron base. This iron here is my Singer iron and it's a continuous steam flow, so all the water is actually in the base. I can bring the tip of my iron in, get that started. Now I'm not going to be pressing any creases into this fabric here, so I've got a nice flat surface to work on. You give some nice bit of steam there, probably fogging up my camera. Get that so that that sits really nice and flat. We would be doing this to the lining and the exterior, all our side seams. So get them nicely pressed. Now here where I've got that bit of bulk, I like to come in and just give that a really good press. Apply a little bit of pressure with your iron just to get them to sit nice and flat. Now if you happen to have one of these handy little tools, it's called a clapper. I use this a lot for dressmaking. It's very common for dressmaking. When we press this seam, and while it's nice and hot, we can use our clapper to help set that seam. See how it'll just sit really crisp. I'll come along on this little bulky bit there where I've got all those connecting seams. Hold that and give it a good little press and it will sit and stay beautifully and flat. I'll just come down and finish that last bit there. Puts like a really good memory crease in those seams. So beautiful, crisp, lovely flat seam there. Now, if you happen to have a sleeve board, something similar to this handy little gadget, what we can do, we can open up our tote, pop the little sleeve board inside, move the bulk of the bag out of the way. Now I've got access to this whole side seam. I can go along, give that a little finger press open, use my iron, come along, and I've got access to this whole seam. Give it a good steam press. And there we go, a lovely flat open press seam. I still am going to come back through and I'm going to use my clapper. You can see these still sit up just ever so slightly, and if we do our clapper, have a look at the difference. Sit that on top, let that just cool slightly, and it just lays down beautifully and flat. Come along and do that where I've got that bulky bit of the seam. And we've got a beautiful flat finished seam there. So that's just a couple of options there to show you different ways that you can press those seams open. So if we look from the inside, you can see it's a beautiful flat finish. Now we just need to do the exact same thing with our lining or your exterior, whichever way you decide to use your bag. So here's my other panel. I'll just come along, give those seams a good press just to set the stitches in place. The noise you hear there, that's my ironing press generating steam in that chamber. So they're done. Again there, I can use that option where I pull it to the center, but because I've got a sleeve board, I'm going to use my sleeve board. Poke that inside. I don't have any straps to contend with on this one, but I did have the pockets. So having the sleeve board, I can now got a lovely flat surface to work on. Finger press those seams open, and I'll come along with my iron, give them some good steam. This iron has a continuous steam function, so I don't even have to press any buttons, and I just get a continuous flow of steam. How good is that? Turn that off, come along with my clapper, and I'll set that seam in place. Now I'll do the other side, turn my bag around a little, get everything out of the road, finger press this seam open, come along, get some good steam. And I can set that seam in place. And it's done. Our bottom seam was already open and flat because we top stitched that. So there we go, our side seams are lovely and flat. Now to box the corners, all we need to do, bring these side seam towards the bottom seam. Line up those stitch seam lines so they're lined up together. Everything should line up perfectly. These little edges should be perfectly lined up. We can now place a pin if we want to make sure that these seams intersect where we've stitched them. We can line up that stitch line, place a pin around about at that 1/2 inch mark. There's my pin has come through, and if I push that pin into that same stitch line, I've now got perfectly intersecting seams. Now I can place a couple more pins if I want to use pins, or I can use clips. I just find on a fabric bag I quite like using the pins, and then I know these can't shift. So now we've got this is the bottom of our bag. There's our side seam. We're going to do the same thing. Bottom seam is down here, side seam. If you've got these little threads there, just snip those off. Now we'll do the same thing. Oh, no matter how careful you are, you can always end up with threads in your seams. So I'm lining up that seam line, bring up these raw edges together. I'll get a pin, poke a pin around about where that 1/2 inch seam line is, connect it to the other stitching line, line those up so that these raw edges meet, and secure that pin. So now when I stitch those together, I've got a really good chance that these seams will intersect. Now if you want to use clips, just place your clips in. Another thing, if you want to make sure that everything stays flat, you can also place a couple more clips just at the sides here, just to keep everything nice and flat for you. So that's now ready to sew, and we're going to sew along here at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And we're going to do the exact same thing for the other part of the bag, whether it's your class as your exterior or your lining. So here's my what I'm calling exterior, my main exterior. So I'm getting the bottom of my bag. There's my bottom. Lay that out. There's my side panel. And again there, I'm going to line up those stitching lines, and I'll place a pin in that seam allowance. I want to see if I can get them to intersect perfectly when I'm pinning, to help increase my chances of getting them to intersect when I sew them. Edges all line up perfectly. I'll place a pin, and I'll place a pin. The beauty of the pins again is I've got no chance of that fabric shifting on me. I will place another clip just to hold that in place, keeps it nice and flat. And I'm going to do the same now with this opposite edge. Get those stitching lines, there's my stitching line there, get them intersecting. I'll grab another pin, place a pin around about where that seam line's going to go, poke that in, get this lined up, they're intersecting, and secure my pin in place. Get these all nice and straight. These edges here should line up at the sides. I'll just place a clip on this one, whatever you're comfortable with. The main seam that I don't want shifting is that intersecting point. I can place another couple of clips if I like, just to keep them nice and flat. There we go. So this everything's all lined up, and there's our side seam, and this is the bottom corners that we're going to be boxing. So we're going to sew along those. So I can gather these, and we'll head on over to the sewing machine. We're getting very close to the finish line. Okay, so we're back at the sewing machine and we're ready to sew our seams to box our corners. So I'm just going to lay that bit there out of the road. I've got one of my corners here ready to go. Now we're going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm lining up the raw edge of my fabric against that 1/2 inch mark. Make sure I can see it nice and clearly. Putting my presser foot down, I'll take out that pin, drop my needle, and I'm going to reverse stitch. Using a standard stitch length of 2.4 on my machine. Now making sure that these seam allowances are laying nice and flat, coming up to where that pin is, and I'll take that pin out. Lock my stitches at the end, and there we go, there's one of those seams done. Just snip these little threads here. That's all good. So now I'm going to do the other side. Turn the fabric over, make sure everything's out of the road, nice and flat. And because we've put these clips here as well, that helps keep everything nice and flat also. So again there, lining up at my 1/2 inch mark, needle down, reverse to lock stitch, coming up to where those is where the intersecting seams are. Take that pin out, and reverse. Let's take those clips off. So that's one section done, and now I will do my exterior. That was what I'm classing as my main lining, and this is my main exterior. Again there, the bag is reversible. Reverse. Coming up to those intersecting seams. Take that pin out. Those clips off. And I'll do the next side, or the next corner. Same thing again. Reverse. Clips off, and that's our corners have been boxed. So we finished boxing our corners, so they've all been stitched. Now what we need to do is we're going to put the lining inside of the exterior with right sides together. So with my lining, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this through so that it's facing out the right way. Ooh, let's have a look. There's our lining. Let's see how we did with boxing those corners and matching up these seams. I think we did pretty good job. They're intersecting lovely. You'll notice that I didn't trim down the seam allowance. There really is no need, and it helps give a nice bit of structure to those boxed corners. We roll these out and we'll have a look how we did with intersecting seams. Perfectly intersecting seams. So the lining has turned out pretty good. So I'm just going to tuck that zipper pocket inside. So there's our exterior, nice big roomy slip pocket, and there's our zipper pocket. And there's our lining fabric. All sitting pretty. Now what we can do is we want to find the center marks here so that we can get the centers of the front and the back of the tote lined up perfectly. If we get these side seams, line them up so that they're intersecting, pull this fabric over to the edges, and there's our center mark. Now we can, oh, knock the camera. We can do a couple of things. We can place a pin if we like. That'll mark our center, or we can clip little notches or make a mark with a pen, but I'm just going to use a pin. Again, they're coming back to the center, making sure those seams are intersecting. Pull this fabric out, and there's our center mark. If you did want to add a little snip, just take a little tiny little snip out of that corner there, and there's your little center mark. And on this side I've used a pin. So now when we bring these side edges out together, they should perfectly line up like that. So there's our side seams and there's our centers. Now we'll do the same with the exterior. I'm just going to pop those handles inside. Our shoulder straps, they're inside and out of the road. Now there's our side seams. There's our straps. You may still have a mark where your centers were, where we did the marks from the straps, depending on what marking tool you used. Let's have a look. I've got one mark there, that's I can see, and there's my other mark. So I can just use those. Place a pin, and I can place a pin in there. If not, again there, connect those side seams, pull the fabric out, there's your centre mark. Holding that there, pull that out, and there's my centre mark. Did I get it lined up pretty good? Might have my pin, it helps if I probably use a straight pin. Let me get that lined up again. Pulled out taut, there's my little crease, and I can place a pin in there. Now I've got my centres marked. Now what we want to do is we want to put the lining inside so that the fabrics are facing right sides together. Squish him in. Now if you had different pockets or things like that on your exterior, just work out which side you want your front or your back or whatever it is. In this case my exterior is the same on both sides, so I just need to line up. There's my centre mark, there's my centre mark. I'm going to pin those two together so they line up. I'm going to come around to this side seam and I'll make sure they line up. Get those little seams. Now I'm going to use a pin again to get these seams to intersect. We're going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm putting my pin in around about that 1/2 inch mark. Make sure they're lined up, looking good, and secure that pin in place. Now I'll come around now. There's my side, there's my centre front or back. I'm just going to place a pin. Can use clips. Now if you didn't put in a zipper pocket, you are going to leave the section between the straps open, because that will be where you will turn your bag through. But in this instance I've put a zipper pocket and we're going to turn the bag through the zipper pocket so I can close this right up. If you didn't put the zipper pocket in, I suggest placing another pin on the other side of that strap, coming over here, get these sides connected so they're perfectly lined up, looking pretty good there. Put in a pin to get them to intersect perfectly. Going into the other seam, get them lined up and secure that pin. I didn't quite get that seam there, so I'm just going to come out, place that pin in again, open this up and get it to intersect. There we go. They're intersecting. Pull these, put a pin on this outside of the strap, and then I'll put a pin on this side of the strap. Now, so these are secured. Now on this side, or whichever side you're going to leave open, we'll get this lined up. So that's matching. I'll get this side here lined up. That's matching. Now if you want to make sure that you don't forget to leave the opening, we can add in some extra pins or make a mark to help us. I'll do this first. Now, so we need to leave an opening if we didn't do a zipper pocket. So we're going to leave this open, but we're going to stitch here and we're going to back stitch really well so that when we turn this through. I'll show you as well at the sewing machine where you would stop and start, but you can use a fabric marker, like if I did a friction pen, I can make a mark here just to remind myself, leave this open. Just doing that. Any like kind of little thing that will help you to remember, don't sew that closed. Okay, so we're back over at the sewing machine. We've got everything pinned in place. Now if you were going to be turning your bag through this top opening section, you will start your stitches here, do some locking stitches, and you'll sew around, and you'll come back to this section and you'll do some locking stitches, and you'll leave this section open. In the pattern there's some detailed photographs as well on doing this section of the bag and turning it through and then sealing it up. But in this instance we actually have a zipper pocket in the lining, and we'll be turning our bag through that zipper pocket. So I'll be sewing all the way around. Now you can take, like if you've got a bed on your machine, you can take that off and use your free arm and sew in a circle, but it is a nice big roomy open tote. So I'm just going to pull back this side, and I'm going to sew from the inside here, and I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I am also using a stitch length of 2.4. So nice neat stitching we want, because we want this seam allowance to be even all the way around. Put my needle down. I will still do just a couple of locking stitches there, and I just need to sew all the way around. When I get to my straps, the beauty of having the pins here is that helps keep these straps nice and straight. If they don't feel like they're sitting nice and straight, just adjust. You can sort of push the little straps into place there, because we do want them to look nice and straight when we turn our bag through. Now we can do some extra stitches here just to help secure those straps in place, but they will be getting top stitched as well, so which is another additional row of stitches which will also reinforce them. So I'm just turning a bit of my bag around, so I've still got then a lovely nice big straight area to sew. Because I've used pins, nothing's going to shift on me. And I'm coming over the other edge of that strap. I'll reverse stitch there and just keep going. When I get to these side seams, I'm just going to make sure that the seam allowance is staying open underneath. So keep that nice and flat. Go over those side seams. Just take that pin out. Bring a bit more of my bag around. Get that nice and flat. So we don't want to have any puckers or anything underneath this fabric here. Coming up to another strap, and I know I'm out of strap because I've got my 2 pins. Take this pin out. I'll do some reinforcing. Come over the end, and I'll do some more reinforcing stitches there. Turn a bit more of this bag around. Now this was one area there that I hadn't pinned together when I was showing how to leave a section open, but we chose to do it on the other area. Just get these loose threads out of the road. I'll just cut those off. There we go. Take out that pin. Got another strap that I'm coming up to. Again there, I know I'm out of strap. I've got the 2 pins. Some reinforcing stitches. I wasn't concentrating and my seam allowance ended up a little bit smaller. I'm actually going to cut my threads. You can see where I've shifted over a little bit. I'm going to come back to where I went off, where I wasn't concentrating, and I'm going to go back. I don't need to do any locking stitches, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm at that 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I just want to make sure everything stays even. So that can happen sometimes. The bulk of the bag can pull the fabric away, but that's all I do to go back in and fix that. I like to do that as I'm going instead of then coming back later. I'll do some more reinforcing stitches on the other side of this strap. Focusing on keeping that 1/2 inch seam allowance now. So here we go. Make sure this is still all nice and flat. Coming up to that other side seam. So when I get over this section of my machine, I'll make sure that everything's still, the seams are still open. Double check, and they're open. take that pin out, just readjusting again, get everything nice and flat, and keep going. Over that strap. Because I didn't have that second pin there, I didn't realise until I sort of felt it. And reinforce this side of the strap, and now I'm just going to come up and connect these stitchings. I'll go over and I will just lock that in place. And there we go. Everything's all closed up. If you had had that opening, you would have an opening section here. So that's where you can see where I had gone off my stitching line. So I'm back on track again there now. So otherwise I would have had a wonky seam. So this is where I wasn't quite at a 1/2 inch. So now comes the fun part. We're going to turn this bag right side out through this zipper pocket. We're not trimming this seam allowance. We're leaving it exactly as it is. It helps give more structure around the top of the bag. I'll just zoom out a bit so you can see. So there's my zipper pocket. I can feel inside. I should have had that zipper open, but I didn't leave it open. But that's all right. I can feel the back of the zipper pull, and I can just sort of pull it along. So I'm in there opening up that zipper pocket, open it up all the way. And now I'm going to reach in. I can feel those straps. I'm going to pull this through and pull everything through. Pull this section out. It's a nice easy bag to turn out because I've given you a nice big zipper pocket. And I'm just going to keep pulling. There's my exterior is out. Now I'm going to grab this lining here and I'm going to pull that through. So now I've got like a big long sausage. So you can see there's my lining and there's my exterior, and there's where our straps are. I can see a thread there, so I'm just going to snip that. Get that one done. Now what we can do is, we're not going to close up this zipper pocket just yet because we might want to get our hands in there, but I am just going to push it in. Now we can go to the sewing machine, to the ironing press, and we can give those a press along there. But what I find is if I just pull this, just finger press that seam, I'm pressing it towards the lining, just give it a little finger press. So we want to create a bit of a nice crisp edge there for when we turn this bag through. Little finger press, creating a nice little crease. My straps down here, little finger press. So again there, my seam allowances, I can feel them, they're going up towards that lining. Turn it around a bit more, give it a little finger press. Just helps create like a bit of a memory crease there. Coming around, again there, give it a finger press. You can see a little tiny little thread there. I'll pull it because I might not find that later. Got him. Finger press. Coming around again. Nice and flat. Finger press. I'm finding that my seam allowance is naturally sort of going towards the lining. Little finger press, and we are back around. Little finger press. And I'll do this section as well. I think we're back to where we started. There's our zipper pocket. Now what we want to do is I'm going to hold on to this seam allowance and I'm going to push this lining inside the exterior. So it's just coming along around about where that seam is, starting to get that pushed in. There's that seam, giving that a little finger press, get everything in. There's some more, get that lining in. Normally I would stand up, or I'd probably hold it at a bit of a different angle, but I'm just trying to keep it in camera view for you. So our lining is inside. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just push it all the way in. There's my straps out. There's our seam. We want that folded edge of that seam sitting right at that top edge. So you can give that a little finger press just to get it in place. Pull this strap up, that helps. That's in there really nice and secure. Come around. Now I'm doing a finger press here, but I will also go over to the iron and I will give this a press with the iron before I stitch it down, do any top stitching. But just doing this little bit of a roll, just in a finger press, just helps to get everything sitting where it should be. Just pushing some more of that in. There's those lovely intersecting seams. And my finger press, I'm sort of just rolling between my fingers, bringing that seam up to the top. Pushing that seam allowance like we did before we turned it out makes lining up these edges much easier. And nearly back where I started. A bit of a roll. It's another nice intersecting seam. Because we pinned it in place, they line up beautifully. And we're back where we started. So that's all sitting there nicely. Now I'm going to go over to my ironing board and I'll put this over the end of the ironing board and I'll just give that a little press all the way around, and then we'll meet you back here at the sewing machine. Okay, back at the sewing machine, I've given that a lovely nice little press, so all my seams are right at the top there of my tote. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the table from my machine. I'll set that to the side and I'm going to use the free arm of my machine to do some top stitching. So I'm going to get my straps out of the road, putting this edge, sliding that over the machine. I need to get this strap up this way as well, and I'm going to be top stitching all the way around. So I don't want to accidentally sew my straps down because they need to be up this way. Now the width that you use for your top stitching really is up to you. Now I actually quite like the look. I don't like the look of stitching right up close to the edge. I actually prefer a bit wider, sort of a bit more than 1/8 of an inch and maybe not quite a quarter. If you find somewhere on your presser foot or on the bed of your machine, and if you keep this folded edge of your fabric lined up exactly there, you'll end up with a fairly even top stitch around the top of the bag. If you're really new to sewing, maybe use 1/4 inch. That way then if your seam is a little bit wavy, it won't be as noticeable as if you were stitching it right up close to the edge here. So for this bag here, I'm actually going to use the inside edge of my foot. I like that look. And I'm going to do a top stitch of a stitch length of 3. So I'm just adjusting my machine because that sort of keeps in consistent with the top stitching length that I had used elsewhere in the bag. You can use a longer stitch length if you like. Now I'm going to put my needle down and I'm going to just keep this nice and straight, lining up at the points that I've decided to use on my machine. I will do a little locking stitch. I'm just going to do about 2 stitches to lock that. It's not a structural seam. I don't want sort of like big long locking stitches on this one. And I'm just going to go all the way around, turning my bag as I go and keeping these straps out of the way. You might need to go a little bit slower over these straps, depends on how thick they are and the materials that you've used. I'm just making sure that this fabric stays sort of underneath as I'm going. There's no need to use pins or clips or anything. If you've pressed that, it should stay pretty good. Just making sure everything stays in place as I'm going. Coming up to that side seam. Just turning this bag through a little more. I've got a strap coming up. Just go slow. You want to keep it nice. Remember, we've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance underneath there, so our seam allowance is actually down here, so this has given us a really nice strong top to our bag. Coming up to another strap, I'm just adjusting so that I can keep this fabric nice and straight. My little strap out of the road. No need to reinforce those straps, we've already done that inside, so they're well and truly secure in there. Just adjusting again. Because I've got pockets and things like that in there, I need to just sort of keep making sure everything's laying flat. Over those straps. We're nearly at the beginning again, so I'm just going to snip these little threads from the front and the back. And when I come up to do these, I'm just going to do a couple of stitches to lock this in place. And there's my stitches there. I'll go over just a couple and back a couple. And I'll go forward one. Lock those stitches. So let's pull this out. Now I need to snip those threads. My machine pulls them through to the back. I'll snip those off. And this is, let me see, hopefully you can see, that's my little locking stitches there. Really not even noticeable, and that's from the back. So that's our beautiful top stitching on the bag. So you can see it looks lovely. It looks really nice and neat all the way around. Looks lovely front and back. Really happy with that. Going along, just double checking everything, make sure I'm happy with it all. If there was anything I wasn't happy with, now would be the time that I would unpick, and I wouldn't unpick the whole thing, I would just unpick the section that I wasn't happy with, and I would just sew wherever it happened to be. And there we go, our bag is almost finished. If you've done the zipper pocket, what you can do now is you can get your hand in, pull out that zipper pocket, and we're going to close it up. So to close it up, all I'm going to do is there's my little side seams at the sides there. Bring these edges together, and I'm going to fold in. You can do 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch. 1/2 inch is roughly a 1/2 inch. Just going to get those sides. I can open up those seam allowances if I liked, or just keep them there, whatever is easy for you. I might actually open them up. Yeah. Let me get my fingers in there, feeling like I'm all fingers and thumbs. Fold that over. I can put a clip there if I like, just to help hold that in place. Now what I want to do, whatever length I've chosen on this side, that's probably a little bit much, is I'm going to do roughly the same on this side. So I'll open up that seam allowance, fold that over, have a look, looks pretty good. And I'll put a clip there. You can use a pin. Now if I can put my fingers in here and I give that a tug, those edges automatically want to fold in. So I can just come along and give this a little finger press. That sort of helps create a crease. Might just pop a pin there for now just to hold that in place. Come along this side, give that another little flip, do another little finger press, keeping those seam allowances roughly the same. Then I can line up these. It looks like that's pulling this over. That looks pretty centered. That looks pretty centered. I'm just going to pop a pin in there. You can just use a clip. And then I'll come over here, line these up. I'm going to pop another pin or a clip. I'll take this clip out, tuck everything in. Everything's laying in there nice and flat. There's that side seam. Get them fairly lined up across here. And I'll place another pin there. And I'll do the same for this side. Come over, might even just take that clip out now, put my finger in there, tuck those in. There's my side seam. Get them lined up. Pop in a pin there. I'm just putting a couple of pins just to keep this these edges lined up together. Now what I want to do is I'm going to sew across here with a little bit, about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I want to sew fairly close to the edge there, and that'll close up that pocket. Now there is a little bit of bulk here at that side seam, not a great deal, but what we can do is we can use our hump jumper. Let me grab mine. So I've got my little hump jumper. I can just sit this behind there. That just helps lift up that foot. I can lock that in place, and if I lift that up, that foot will usually stay in place, but I quite like my hump jumper. Lifts that up so that this presser foot is even with this edge of this pocket. Just keep that there. My foot's down. Just going to drop my needle down. I'll sew a couple of stitches. See how the foot will just easily glide over that little hump. Now I'm going to reverse stitch a couple just to lock those stitches in place and go forward. The pins are helping keep everything in place. I'll grab my little hump jumper so it doesn't get pushed to the floor, and I'll just take my pins out as I go. Main thing here is we just want to make sure that we're catching the front and the back of this pocket. It's sitting inside the pocket, so it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. No one's going to see it. It's a lovely big zipper pocket, this one. You can fit heaps in there. Now I'm coming up to the end. I may need to use my hump jumper again when I go to backstitch. We'll see how we go. Might be good, looking good. And and back stitch just to lock those in place. Just a couple of stitches is plenty. Snip those threads. So I'll trim off these little thread tails there, and then do this side, trim this little tail. That's looking pretty good. So there's our stitching, and just make sure that you have caught both sides. Now, because I've used the pins there again, nothing shifted, everything stayed exactly where I wanted it. So now all I need to do is poke that pocket inside, and I like to just push those little corners out. So they're tucked in there and pushed out. I can close up that zipper pocket now. And our tote is finished. Let me just take the camera out a little and we can have a look to see how it turned out. Move that out of the road. So I'll get the camera up a little bit there for you. There's our tote, all done. So depending on what interfacing you use will determine how structural it is. If we can get in now and we can just poke that lining into those corners, it's already sort of sitting in there. Just double check you haven't got any threads loose. So there's, now when we want to put our tote away, we can fold it up and it can sit like that. When we want to put it away, there's the other side. There's our side seams. They look pretty good. There's our lovely little boxed corners. All our seams are all matched up nicely. There's our other side seam. Everything looks really, really good. So there we go. Inside, there's our zipper pocket. All finished and all closed up. This side, we've got our slip pocket. Now, if we want, we can turn it out and use it as a reversible tote. I'll close up that zipper pocket. I just like to push those little corners out. They tend to stay pretty well in place. Just get your hand in there and there we go. There's the other side of our tote. So we've got the zipper pocket side. Open it up. There's our pocket. Turn it around. And there's our big slip pocket. So you've now got a fully reversible gorgeous tote, and it's pretty whichever way you look at it. You can do this same effect on both sides. You can put the slip pocket or a zipper pocket, or zipper pockets on all the panels, or slip pockets on all the panels. You really can have a lot of fun with this tote. I have made so many. It's just such a fun tote to make.